I'll see you guys in the dark.
This was about a year ago. For background, I was walking home from the university with my backpack. The quickest route, and one I took often, was to cut through a park. On my left would be thick brush with trees, quite dense, no visual after 20 meters. Then construction for a new housing estate, and on the right was a woods, and then an opening hill with benches along the path. So I'm walking home about 4 p.m., and as I'm about to get to the path, I see a man stand up from where he was laying on the grass wearing one of those sleeping bag suits and a hoodie underneath. I didn't think too much of it, assumed he was just homeless. He got up and walked up the path behind me. As I come up the path, I see him joined by another man in a high-vised jacket holding a 4-foot-long stick, and they were both stood still talking with woods to either side of them. Alarm bells rang off. As I come up to pass both of them, the second guy stops me and says words to the effect of, "I just heard a girl scream from inside the woods," and pointed to the trees to my left. I do not buy this for a second, given the time I told him it was most likely a couple of kids let out of school, but he is adamant that I alone and unarmed go into the woods ahead of him and check it out. I take another look at the stick and tell him I'll call the police when I'm home. No chance I'm pulling my phone out in front of these highwaymen. I walk away, and as I get to the benches, I see 2 young girls, and I ask them if they heard a child scream. They answered no, but imagine you're a child, and a bearded bloke approaches and asks you a question. You want that guy to just go away. So I nodded, warned them of the actual creeps, and I left to the park. As soon as I was clear of the park, I called the police, informed them of what had happened, and gave my best description as I could. Spoke to a couple of officers when they arrived, and pointed them in the direction of the 2 young girls and the 2 creepy fellas. Haven't heard a peep since. I know exactly what would have happened if I went into the wood block, except for the extent of how much they would hurt me. I'm happy with my response to the situation, though. If something makes you uncomfortable, remember what you can with the situation, and just leave. Yesterday I took my dog to the park as I normally do. It was a cold but sunny day, so when I got there about half the parking lot was full. However, everyone seemed to be leaving. As we were walking towards the wooded part of the park, I noticed a man dressed in all black with big sunglasses and a huge handkerchief covering his face. Kinda gave me the creeps, but I ignored him. When we were halfway through the park, I heard a man yelling, and I couldn't see anyone. My dog was standing very alert and growling, and I turned around and the man I saw earlier was standing right behind me. "You freaking stupid bitch, excuse me. Move your freaking car." "Mine?" "Yes, you stupid cunt. Move your freaking car." "Is there something wrong with it?" "You're parked way too close to me, and there's an empty freaking lot." At this point, I'm just confused and a little scared. I told him it wasn't empty when I got there, but I was happy to move it because I didn't want to piss him off any more than he already was. He followed me and walked behind me muttering cuss words and insults to me. Then he said, "You're so lucky I found you. I have a crowbar in my car, and I was going to smash your windows and slash your tires. Then I was going to find you and smash your freaking head in. But I'm having a good day today. I'm in a really good mood. It's just stupid bitches like you that ruin things." I had my mace in my hand and my knife in the other. We kept walking towards the parking lot, but he kept getting angrier. He screamed at me, "Aren't you going to apologize, you cunt?" I told him I was sorry and that I hope he was having a better day. He said, "Better day? I'm having a great day. You're alive, aren't you?" I started to walk faster, and so did he. I made a full sprint to my car, and the guy just stopped and watched me laughing. He started throwing sticks and rocks at my car while laughing as I was driving off. I filed a police report. I don't know if he was just trying to scare me or what, but I hope he doesn't actually hurt someone in the near future. The story starts with me failing to bring my big, energetic dog to the park at a reasonable hour. It's late at night, approaching around 11 p.m., but she's going stir crazy, and my girlfriend is very upset, so I decide to bring her over there despite how late it is. However, I still have work to do, so I foolishly decide to bring my laptop with me to a remote area practically guaranteed to be empty. As I'm plugging away at my computer, a man in a Lakers windbreaker comes walking down the street, heading to the right. The entire time he's looking directly at me, even turning his head all the way around as he walks past. He finally gets about 50 yards down the road where the gate to the dog park is. Suddenly, he stops. He looks around, clearly looking up and down the road to see if there were any bystanders coming, and weighing a decision. After a few moments, he opens the gate and starts walking right towards me. Seeing the geography of the park, you would realize immediately, as I did, that there are no conceivable way he could have been intending to come to the park before he saw me. There is absolutely no doubt that he is intending to mug me and steal my laptop. I'm not scared though. I'm angry, and frankly offended that this guy thinks I'm an easy target. So I calmly stand up and walk over to one of the shovels lying on the ground that people use to clean up after their dogs. I disappointingly pick it up and walk back to where my stuff is. I square my shoulders, puff out my chest, and confidently sling the shovel over my shoulder. He's about 20 feet away from me at this point. He's still approaching me, but slightly more slowly, and his posture seems just a bit doubtful, if that makes any sense. So I call out to him, something like, "Fine evening we got here. How are you doing, pal?" Which I hoped as a good choice that would sound relatively normal and not like a nerd trying to sound tough. I try to put as much menace as I could on it without sounding cartoonish. I must have done a good enough job because at this point he stops walking. I'm expecting him to say something back, and I'm watching his hands, which are still in his pockets. A few moments go by like he's sizing me up and doing a cost-benefit analysis. And then, without a word, he turns around and walks away. This was the first time anyone tried to mug me. I was all adrenaline and anger in the moment, but looking back on it, I'm lucky how it played out. I'm not sure I could have actually beaten him in a fight, but I had a pretty dangerous-looking shovel and was genuinely willing to use it. And I knew he probably wasn't going to risk a trip to the hospital, or worse, just for a generic laptop. But I'm also really glad he didn't pull a gun or a knife on me. Still, I'm really proud of my response.
This happened about 9 years ago when I was in middle school. I had totally forgotten about it until my friend brought it up yesterday. In 7th grade, my best friend and I would walk down to her family's restaurant after school. It was about 4 blocks from the school. Not a long walk at all. Between the school and the restaurant there is a public park with a playground. Only kids from the school would hang out there though. Sometimes when the weather was nice we would hang out at the park. If we were there for more than an hour, usually her uncle would come check on us. We did this for most of the school year. Around March, a strange man started showing up around the park trying to talk to girls, asking them about the school or things they would like to do. He did this for a couple of weeks, and then suddenly disappeared. We never really thought much of it. Then one day, it was just my friend and I at the park, and he shows up. He starts talking to my friend, trying to get him to go with her. She keeps telling him no. He grabs her arm and tries to pull her along. We both scream for him to let her go. Her uncle was on the way to check on us, and he could hear us scream. We could see him running towards us. He tackles the guy and tells us to run to the restaurant. We go and tell her mom what happened. Her mom calls the cops, but the guy hit her uncle and just got away. The cops never found him and told us if anything else happened suspicious to call them. So guy at the playground, let's not meet ever again.
Yesterday evening, I went to the cinema with a friend after work and was making my way home around 12 a.m. or so. In my neighborhood, there's a large park that separates the 2 sides of the estate, and it's a good shortcut for getting to the street in my house. Now, before I go on, I should mention that I live in an extremely safe, suburban town in the east of Ireland. I could probably tell you all the major crimes that have happened here in the past 20 years off the top of my head. It's known as being a place that is totally calm, and very out of harm's way. I've walked through this park countless times after dark, sometimes as late as 3 a.m. after a night out with friends, and I've never once come across anything weird or creepy. That changed last night. The park is very big and is mostly a wide open space. You can basically picture it as the perfect place for kids to play a game of football because there's not a lot of trees or bushes in the way. There's also no street lamps or light sources. I was walking up the trail that runs along the border of the park, and as I got about halfway along, a big shape right in the middle of the open space got my attention. It was motionless, so at first I thought it was some sort of goal point or marker that kids left behind after playing. But then as I got closer, it began to move towards me, and I saw it was a person. The entire park was deserted except for the two of us, and I thought it was odd he'd been standing still right in the middle of it. Most people just use the two trails on either side of the park. It was difficult for me to see in the dark, but it looked like a tall man in a long coat with shaggy hair. I looked around for a dog to see if he was out late walking his pet, but saw nothing. He was just slowly striding in my direction. I looked away from him and picked up my pace, telling myself not to be ridiculous. He was probably just crossing the park and was only coincidentally walking towards me. I glanced back at him and saw that when I sped up, he'd change his direction to follow me, still at the same slow pace. I looked away again and walked quicker, but glanced a few seconds later to make sure that he wasn't still following me. He was, but then he stopped, turned away from me, and started motioning with his hands. Think about a traffic warden gesturing for a car to move forward. It looked like he was beckoning something to come towards him. I broke into a light jog for the rest of the park, looking back a few times to make sure he hadn't suddenly started into a run after me. But no, he was still making that same hand signal right where I had left him. I kept up a quick pace all the way to my road, hurried up the driveway to my house, and shuddered when I closed the front door behind me. Even when I walked down through the park this morning on my way into town, I felt uncomfortable when I passed by where he had been. The experience left a bad taste in my mouth for sure.
A few months ago, several people in my family were helping to set up for a cancer benefit Halloween party at a barn-like shelter facility in our local park. We started early in the morning with the decorating, and the finishing touches continued into the early afternoon, so that everything would be ready for the evening's party. My wife had to leave briefly mid-morning and came back around 1 p.m. I was supposed to go home at that point while she took over for me. When I was getting ready to leave, it was just my wife, my sister-in-law, and a couple of my sister-in-law's husband's friends still at the facility decorating. As I went outside to my car, there was a man outside standing by the edge of the shelter's driveway. He just stood there and watched me. I didn't really think anything of this at that moment. And as it was a public park, though he was probably just passing through, taking a walk. Due to my car being somewhat boxed in, I had to drive up a small path to a turnaround and come back down another path to get around the other cars parked at the facility. I noticed this guy just stood there and watched me drive the entire time. He wasn't leaving the shelter property and just kept staring at me. I now took notice and thought it was weird. It doesn't sound like much, but when someone is unapologetically staring you down for no reason, it is unnerving. Instead of leaving, I just pulled my car over and stayed there at the facility. He just kept staring at me intently with no expression. And I also back at him from my car. I thought maybe eventually he would nod, wave, or converse, and ask what kind of evening we were sitting up. But instead he just stood there, had his gaze back at me. A moment went by, and to my surprise, a pickup truck pulls into the facility's driveway and parks along the side of me with a fellow rolling down his window, smiling. It is a guy who asked where to drop the basket donations for our benefit party. He and I chat for a moment, and then I noticed the staring man was still there, just looking at us coldly. I was getting a little annoyed at this situation, and got out of my car this time, and went back into the shelter. I wanted to give my wife and the other ladies a heads up of this strange guy lurking around. I said he may have been trying to watch one of them before I came out, and was perhaps not waiting for me to leave. My wife came back outside with me to get a glimpse of this person and to see where he was. He was gone, but not very far. There was a large parking lot across the road, and he was standing over in that lot, just watching us. I told my wife I was going to leave in my car, but not really leave. I wanted to get to a location that I could watch and see what he was up to. As I pulled out into the road, I see him just intently watching me, and then looked back at the barn facility. I got angry about that, and instead of spying on him from someplace in private as I intended, I pulled into that parking lot he was just standing in. I drove past him all of the way to the end of the park so that I could just sit and watch what he was up to in plain sight. He walked over to a dark blue minivan and opened up the back of it. It appeared he may have been taking something out of it, but I could not see what it was. He then started walking quickly and straight towards my car. I wasn't sure if he had a weapon, and as he approached closer to the passenger side, I pretended I was talking on a cell phone. I probably should have called the police, but I also felt a little odd about it, thinking the only offense I would say he committed was weirdly looking and staring at me. This is a public park after all, not like they would kick him out. As he approached my car, though, I was just waiting for him to do something or say something harassing, or expecting this to turn into a conversation. He then just circled the back of my car and came around by my side of the vehicle. I really thought he may have had a weapon, but I couldn't believe the nerve of him doing this crap in a public place. But as he looked and saw me pretending to be talking on the phone, I think that threw him off of whatever confrontation he was about to do. He kept walking up onto the grass of the hillside by my car, not looking back. I then waited and watched him walk up the hill, disappearing from sight. I figured I would now leave before he came back down the hill. During those few minutes he was on the top of the hill, I drove back to the barn facility my wife was at, and he had walked back down the hill and had got back into the van and quickly left. I had made up my mind if he returned again near our facility, I was going to definitely call the police and confront him to ask why he was lurking around watching us. I didn't see him lurking anymore, so he must have figured I was on to him and he left. I went back into the barn to give an update on the weird staring man. Time passed by, and he did not return. I still don't know what his intentions were, or why he decided to finally leave after our odd standoff, but I am glad it ended peacefully.
I snuck out one night when I was 17 and went to a friend's house. Both my parents went to bed by 9 in order to get up early for work. My girlfriend, who lived out of town, was supposed to meet me at 2 in the morning. My friend would only have visitors until 12, so I had to walk to a nearby park to wait for her. I sat with my back to the wall, reading a book beneath the only light in the park. From here I could see and hear everything in the park. After about an hour, a drunk couple walked past me, leaving the park now completely empty, or so I thought. About 10 minutes after they walked by, a tall, shabbily dressed man in a mid-40s stepped out of the shadows about 30 yards away. There was no other way to or from where he had been, so I knew he had been there the whole time I was at the park. He had just been sitting there silently in the dark. He had waited until that couple left, and I was left alone in the park. Then he had sat there for about 10 more minutes, presumably watching me, so quietly that I didn't notice him until he had got up and moved from the shadows. I kept my book up like I was reading, but I was watching him out of the corner of my eye. He made a path like he was going to walk past me, but he moved slowly and awkwardly, and I could tell he was looking at me the whole time. When he got about 20 feet away, he veered towards me as I lowered my book and stared at him. He stood there for a few seconds as if he was trying to think of something to ask me. He looked so nervous, which led me to believe that he knew he wouldn't be talking to someone my age who was alone in the middle of the night. But he was doing it anyway. Particularly whispering. He asked me if I knew what time it was, not wanting to take out my phone. I told him I could have to guess if it was around 1 in the morning. He asked me a couple equally pointless questions. He stood there awkwardly lingering between questions, I had an annoyed look on my face, which I felt said, "What the fuck are you doing?" Finally, he asked me if I liked guys. Suddenly, I had this overwhelming feeling that he saw me as prey. I rushed to my feet and pulled out my knife. I had what I'm sure was a fearless look in my eyes, and all I said to him was that he needed to get back out there. He listened. Right away, he left. I didn't feel comfortable waiting there by myself, not knowing if he was sitting in the shadows watching me. When I was talking with my girlfriend and my friend later, he told me about how someone had gone door to door putting flyers on everyone's knob, warning the community about a man who had been attending baseball games at the park and trying to lure young boys and girls into his van. The man I saw had fit the description of the one given by the flyer. He left so quickly. I never heard a van leave, though. He looked so guilty. I don't think he even knew that my knife was in my hand. I never flipped it open. I don't have a problem with gay people, but this guy was more than that. There's no doubt in my mind that if I would have seemed timid, things would have gone very differently that night. Maybe I should be, but then as well as I know, I'm not afraid, just a little creeped out. In fact, I wish I would have followed him that night, just to see if he looked for another more submissive potential victim. Lots of bad things have happened at that park since. I often wonder if he's the one doing some of these things. I wonder how things might have gone differently if I had followed him and seen him actually try to hurt someone, and if I had intervened. So, super creepy shadow-dwelling park pervert, let's not meet.
I am, or at least I was, an internet person. I started a little personal blog about nothing really important back in the late 90s, and it continued for well over 10 years. Even though I wrote about nothing more than random life stuff and parenting my kids, it briefly got more moderately popular. I'm not exactly a people person. That's why I became an internet person in the first place. So the popularity was more than a little uncomfortable for me. But after a little while, it wasn't so bad. It's nice having people sympathize with crap you're going through, celebrate life's little joys with you, and just talk. I never felt better or higher than anyone. It felt more like walking into a big sort of Survivors of XYZ Anonymous, where you could all talk as equals and everyone had an audience for what they were saying who were actually listening. That's a nice feeling, no matter where you're coming from. I'm a very shy, neurotic sort, and I don't like interacting with people, so this is a nice medium to be able to socialize with people in a safe way. What isn't so nice is the side effects of any sort of popularity. Fangirls and trolls. The fangirls usually come first, and it's more than the average, "Hey, I like your blog" kind of people. It's the "everything you say is like gospel, and I love you." After that comes the crazies that are polar opposite, generally because they're disgusted by the fangirls and decide themselves better for not having that level of devotion or care. And while the fangirls will go out of their way in hopes of one day catching a glimpse of you at the grocery store, the trolls will go out of their way in hopes of one day finding some random thing you said to twist into a barely believable story to call CPS over, so they can giggle while you undergo a traumatic false investigation. And sometimes these things overlap into an obsessive fangirl, which is what I'm going to talk about. I met her in various communities and in blog comments relatively early on, and she seemed like a normal, nice enough person. I never got the inclination that she was crazy or weird about anything. And eventually I started reading her blog as well, and everything seemed pretty normal. She commented on everything I wrote, no matter what it was, and always had something to say. I was a lot more polite and much more of a doormat back then, so I felt it necessary to always try to at least say something back when she asked questions or engaged in what felt like an attempt at conversation. I didn't want to seem like a self-absorbed dick. Eventually my family and I made a move, and we just so happened to be moving to the same town she was in. This felt neat because, hell, I'd already know someone and had a friend. And as someone who is chronic loner, that seemed pretty cool. I vaguely knew 2 other online people from the same area as well, so bonus! Very shortly after I arrived, her youngest child had a birthday party, and she gave me an invite. Thinking of her as just a friendly face, I decided to come and finally meet this nice lady. I was heavily pregnant at the time, and so was easily recognizable from a distance. She was having a party for her toddler in a public park, and I approached her. She must have recognized me pretty easily, and almost literally dropped her baby on the ground and ran to me across the field. I was a little taken aback at this, but smiled politely nonetheless as she approached. Once she got near me, it became clear she was not just a regular friendly face. She was already near hysterical crying. She blubbered out a barely comprehensible, "It's you! It's you!" as though it was some sort of famous celebrity and not a random parent on the internet. I was incredibly uncomfortable, but tried to politely smile and brush it off. She reached out and grabbed my face and started stroking my skin, my hair, my cheeks, and my shoulders. Her hands were all over me, and in my shock and shyness, I stood there stunned, and neither did nor said anything in protest, even though I was deeply and horribly uncomfortable. "You're so beautiful. You're beautiful," she sobbed as she stroked me. I am a survivor of abuse both in child and in adolescence, which may have been something she'd known, having read very intimate parts of my blog. And this was definitely the sort of behavior that brings that shit up in a big way. To be completely honest, I was in and out for the next few hours. I don't even remember how I got home. But I know that once I zoned out, she spent a lot of time leading me around, touching me, and even telling her other 9-year-old child, "This is the person I've told you about. She helps people. She's so beautiful." If there weren't witnesses to this behavior, I would chalk it up to some sort of waking nightmare. It was one of the most surreal and disturbing experiences I've ever had. After this, I wasn't sure what to do. I realize that sounds rather weak and pathetic, but I suppose that's the kind of person I was at the time. I'd just barely come out of an extremely traumatizing experience and was in the midst of some very intense grief and mental strife. I was weak. I was lonely. I wanted friends, and I wanted to believe that this behavior was a silly fluke and I could have normal friends like a normal person. I figured maybe if I have a few playdates with her kids and she sees me as a regular person, this will all become a hilariously embarrassing thing of the past. That was probably one of the stupidest ideas I have ever had. I'm embarrassed to admit that I even thought of it. Suffice to say, it did not turn out as I'd have hoped. Twice I invited her to my kids' birthday parties, still under the false hope that she'd view me as a normal person and a normal friend if she had regular experiences. I mean, maybe she's really super lonely, going through some shit, and just overwhelmed to meet another mom friend. The denial I was in was pretty deep. Even as my entire brain was screaming, "This is not okay, run!" I still wanted to believe the best of people. She seemed to spend the entire time just blindly staring, as though in love, or mindlessly agreeing with everything I'd say. Compliments from her never, ever sounded normal. They sounded creepy and obsessive, and even my family had noticed something, and was getting weirded out about this. After that, I decided maybe this wasn't worth it, and tried to very, very slowly dislodge myself from her. What I didn't know is that the few times she actually came to my house, she was apparently taking notes. She'd share every tiny detail she saw, but sketched and distorted on various forms. I only heard about this much later on from other people. Mutual friends who became concerned about her behavior after recognizing the very worrisome signs. She'd do things like try to take very old home movies, some so old they'd been or mislabeled, from our cabinet, and when apparently unsuccessful, would make up strange stories online about what they really were, and create narratives about the secrets they held that only she was privy to as a best closest friend. Around the same time I started getting vaguely threatening messages on various social networks, usually from anonymous sources, about things that were in my medical cabinet, on my bookshelf, or other bizarre and creepy things that people couldn't possibly know. A few times on IP addresses that were left behind, and I was able to trace it to a local tower, which scared me all the more. But even then, I was somehow convinced it wasn't her because I didn't want to believe this kind of shit could happen to me. Worse, sometimes the troll-type people would absolutely eat them up, and it become a fun game to scare and harass me with these strange half-truths about. And I was able to trace it to a local tower, which scared me all the more. But even then, I was absolutely convinced that it wasn't her because I didn't want to believe this kind of shit would happen to me. Worse, sometimes these came from multiple accounts, because she'd spread these strange things around to people and trolls, who absolutely ate them up, and it became a fun game to scare and harass me with these strange half-truths that were just true enough to be harassing. And yet untrue enough to be bewildering. If I ever so much barely mentioned it, she'd always be there to reassure me of how nuts and jealous these people must be. Not like her. Not like a real friend. Over a period of a few months, I ignored her enough for her to get the message. And things went from weird to insane. The stories and anonymous threats ramped up tenfold. Sometimes obviously from her, and sometimes from whoever she would get added to her cause. Even after I'd block her on every social media site I could, I'd get alerts from other friends that she knew things and copied things from my life she couldn't possibly know from online activity. If I dyed my hair, her hair had to be the same color and style a week even later if I'd even posted about it. If I knitted something for my kid, she knitted the same project. If I went across town to a new store, she was talking about how great it was to shop there too. It occurred to me that she knew where my kids went to school, and I had to add her name and description to the emergency list of people to never ever release information to because she was actually seen there even though her child didn't attend. I went to the police with this when I realized she was doing drive-bys on my house. But their answer was simply to ignore it or block her because it was involving the internet. I was advised to contact them if she escalated. Eventually, my participation in everything online dwindled to nothing, and very slowly the harassment died out. Though even after a year, it still pops up from time to time in great spurts. My family has moved. My children changed schools. My spouse changed jobs. But because I know she's still in the city, I know there's a possibility she could still track this all down. I wish I wasn't paranoid about her influence, but I am. Because I know this is part of my own fault for believing she was harmless, and thinking I could simply show her how misguided her thinking was. Chalk this up to one hard-learned lesson, I guess. I live in a town in the mountains of southern Appalachia. If you aren't from this region, and that immediately brings to mind visions of poverty and dark hollers, well, they do exist, but the town I am from is a university town with roughly 70,000 people. We have a number of public parks, but in recent years the most popular is one of the newest, which was built on the south side of town and has a dog park, in addition to a normal playground type park for children, and numerous walking trails, some of which go through wooded areas. The path is lit at night throughout most of the park, and although gates are closed at sundown, it isn't uncommon for people to be walking their dogs late at night. There is a large parking lot on one end. This is the main entrance of the park, and it is where the children's playground and the dog park are located, as well as the restrooms, etc. This lot is long, rather than wide, and stretches alongside a sidewalk that runs next to the playground. On the other side of the park, which is to say over some hills and through some lightly forested areas, there is small ponds and another small lot. This lot has a gate just like the bigger one, but it has a little area before the gate where it is common for people walking at night to park their cars. I had a friend back in those days who was an avid walker. She was a couple years older than I was, and although petite, was sort of fearless. She would often go walking at night by herself, and her apartment at the same time was out of sort in the country, but only a mile or so from this park. So sometimes she would drive out there and walk by herself at night as well. I would say things sometimes like, "Oh, you should be more careful, because I am a man who was raised in the South, and we are particularly worried about the females in our lives." She was fairly enlightened and would get angry when I would say things like this. None of this is to say, "I told you so." I'm just trying to paint a picture. Anyway, long story short, I started meeting her some evenings and walking with her, figuring a bearded 6'1", 200-pound man would be a deterrent to some creepers. So one night we were walking, and while there were usually a few other people in the park, it seemed like maybe it was around 8 p.m. So one night we were walking, and while there were usually other people in the park, it seemed like maybe it was around 8 p.m. But like I said, it's been 6 years. Anyway, I had a rental car that week because of some work being done on my car, and I had parked it behind the gate on the wooded side of the park. As we came through the woods and rounded a hill towards the main entrance of the park, I sort of clocked a van in my peripheral vision that was pulling in the gates of the park, which for whatever reason had not yet been closed. The weird thing about this was that it was sort of a cliche creeper van. It was an older model Chevy van with no windows in the back, a sort of molted rust and paint job. Dark tinted windows in the front for a lot of you. Depending on where you live, this might already be raising alarms. But in Tennessee, this is like every fifth car on the road. As we walked up to the sidewalk parallel to the park, the van turned behind us and then drove slowly past our left, coming almost to a stop, and then speeding up to a circle around ahead of us at the other end of the lot. At this point, obviously, I was paying closer attention. Now the van came back towards us, and the driver's window was down. This would be the part where a lot of naysayers would probably think I'm making this up, because the man staring at us from that van was about the closest thing to a cliche creep I could think of. He was large, bigger than me, with weird aviator-style glasses that may have been sunglasses, but were transparent enough that you could still see his eyes. He was wearing a hat and a camo-style coat, and he had a black mustache. He idled not 10 feet from us, just staring at us emotionless for a moment. We both sort of stopped, stiffened, and looked back at him. There was something about his gaze, some cold malevolence, the likes of which I hadn't really ever felt in my life, which immediately chilled me to the bone. I have read articles about sociopaths and psychopaths, where scientists theorize that the reason we feel uneasy in our presence is tied into an incident's biological response from the times when truly we were the prey, and they were alpha predators among human groups or tribes. I felt that in that moment. I felt like it was out in the wild, naked on the tundra, and he was zeroing in on me. It was this feeling more than anything that elevated this moment for me from merely dealing with a creep to something that was perhaps more sinister. I grabbed my friend by the arm and said roughly, "Let's go," and started quickly across the field towards the series of hills and trees that were between us and the car. Leaving the sidewalk behind, she was sort of shocked at first and followed quickly. We half walked and half ran a few hundred yards before realizing that the van had pulled out of the lot behind us and just disappeared. My adrenaline was still pumping, and we had a quick conversation, basically consisting of what in God's name was that, and let's get to the car and get out of here. We quickly moved through the woods and started back down the hill as it descends towards the lot. There were a couple of wide, sweeping switchbacks with some trees and shrubs alongside. We crested the hills and could see the lot below, and what we saw there made my blood stop pumping for a moment. Behind my rental car, the Chevy van was parked, with its bright lights shining on my car and up the hill a little ways. We hid behind some foliage and watched as the We hid behind some foliage and watched as he switched his headlights on and off for a moment or two. Then he pulled back a bit and shined his brights further up the hill. He sat there for a long moment as we cursed the fact that we had left the cell phones in the car and tried to decide what to do. Of course, when he abruptly peeled out of the parking lot and took off down the road, we took off running down the hill towards the car, and we're just outside the ring of trees near the lot when he suddenly swung back in. He started shining his brights off and on in the trees again. At this point, I was thinking I was going to have to attack him or something to try and draw him away long enough for my friend to escape. Fear, adrenaline, and anger all covered me in like a dark river, and I was probably seconds away from busting out from the trees and taking a run at him when he once again peeled out of the lot as fast as he could. Well, you didn't have to tell us twice. We sprinted the remaining distance to the rental car and jumped in. I took off and went about 60 miles an hour down the road until we got into the neighborhood. I never saw the van on the road. In fact, I didn't see any cars until we got to the main road. I have no idea where he went, if he was sitting somewhere off the road watching or waiting. When we got back to the apartment, and my friend told me that she would finally accept a can of mace if I wanted to give her one. We had a good laugh at that, but we were desperately shaken. We decompressed and talked about it for a while, and I agreed to contact the police the next day. I went down to the station and told an officer what had happened. I never heard anything else about it. I have no idea what he wanted. We joked that we were 5 minutes away from being turned into lamps, but really I have no idea. Maybe he was just a pervert. Maybe he was just a good old boy that just didn't like the idea of people in the dark after dark. Maybe he was a good old boy that just didn't like people in the park after dark. But that look he gave me when he was idling next to us makes me think we were pretty lucky to get away. Whatever his intentions, I would surely be glad to never meet him again.
If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe, like, and hit the bell for notifications on future videos, and become a stalker of the night. And I'll see you next time.